Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil karim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon to everyone. Today we are very honored to have with us Professor Dr. Ebrahim Moosa from Notre Dame University, United States. And he will be speaking on the topic of critical traditionalism in Islamic thought, history, norms, and modernity. فليتفضل مشكورا.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وما والاه. Thank you very much to the Dean Abdulaziz, Professor Abdulaziz Barghouth, Professor Usman Bakr, and Professor Hisham, some of the friends that I've come to know. There might be other people in the room there that I have not acknowledged. Please apologize. It's really a great honor to be here with you today and to share some thoughts on a topic that is occupying me these days about the whole question of Islamic thought. So where does this motivation for this come from? You know, for much of the 20th century, we've had Islamic revivalist movements that have been promoting a certain discourse about Islam, questions about, you know, how to practice Islam, political Islam. But one of the things that I felt that was left by the wayside is the idea of a tradition. What is a tradition? What is an intellectual tradition? And the more I think about that is that the discourse on Islam becomes increasingly thin and narrowed and simplistic. The complexity of Ghazali or Muhyiddin ibn Arabi or say even Ibn Taymiyyah, that levels of complexity has disappeared. You find scholars would translate the Quran and not do serious work on the philology, for instance. That the word deen, for instance, when people talk about wadhalika, you know, when they talk about the hisab of the month, the various calculations of the month, and then wadhalika deenul qayyim, people translate that as that is, you know, that is the correct deen. It means that that is the correct hisab. It's a proper calculation. So the philology, the deep thought in Islamic thought, in my view, is disappearing. And I believe that we have to turn to tradition again. But how do we turn to tradition? That's important. Okay? So many people find the study of the, I'm going to say in a minute, what do I mean by tradition? Many people find that to go back to the tradition is too much work. Islam is simple, it's the Quran and the Sunnah. And I say, yes, it is the Quran and the Sunnah, but it is how you interpret the Quran and the Sunnah. What are the various levels of background understanding before you come to understand the Quran and the Sunnah? So that's precisely what I've been trying to explore. So I would say that, you know, in my view, Islamic thought generally, from Islamic law to theology, tradition for several reasons play an important role. Firstly, tradition is primarily the memory of the civilization. Tradition is the memory, thank you. Tradition is the memory of the civilization. Secondly, and it's the civilizational process. Secondly, it's a memory of a faith tradition, its norms and values. And thirdly, the memory of this tradition later morphs and mutates into its founding documents, because an early period, what the people saw of the Prophet ﷺ was memorized through memory. The Quran was also, some amount was written down, but most of it was carried in the hearts. So this memory, what people remembered, became the founding documents, which then became the sources of Islamic history. And fourthly, over time, this develops into a very robust and diverse, discursive tradition. So what do I mean by discursive tradition? Discursive tradition is a tradition, a knowledge tradition, where there are arguments about what is knowledge. A discursive tradition, a madhab. A madhab is a discursive tradition. It's where people have debates and discussions and disagreements and agreements about what constitutes knowledge. For some, a hadith marfu has one status. For others, a hadith غير متصل has another status. A verse with is a general verse, a khas verse has different statuses. And that constitutes different epistemic components to make an argument, to make a proof, to make a determination, to make a dalil, and how these adilla are constituted to make an argument. So I argue that Islam is, as Talal Asad also says, Islam is a discursive tradition, it is a knowledge tradition. So I don't think this should be anything new that I'm telling you. You all know this, but we don't think about it in this way. We don't think that this is a knowledge tradition, that it is put together by human beings. It's human beings at different times in different places put this knowledge tradition together and developed consensus and ideas around it. Fifthly, tradition over time exercised an extraordinary grasp, an extraordinary hold on the Muslim imagination, which gave Muslim culture and civilization a sense of longevity, uniformity, diversity, and endurance across many, many transitions. From the desert polity of 7th century Arabia, you find the remarkable expansionist developments of the Umayyads. Within an 80-year period, the Umayyads is the biggest empire in the world at that time. Within 80 years, one of the biggest empires, followed by the Abbasids. I mean, the Umayyads are actually, yes, there are some problems with the Umayyads politically. Some Umayyads, everybody is not too happy with some of the activities that some of the Umayyad Khulafa did. But if it wasn't for the Umayyads, the development of knowledge and translation, as the Umayyads conquered, they gave entire incomes of certain territories that were conquered for the translation process, from Greek into Arabic, in particular. So the Umayyads, we owe the Umayyads a great debt that they thought very quickly that we need to build a civilization, and this civilization is based on knowledge, information. The Abbasids, as you know, their great contribution was to take lots of Zoroastrian material that was published in what we call Middle Persian, in Pahlavi, and lots of translation from Pahlavi got into Arabic. And the Zoroastrians were absolutely very, very almost passionate about knowledge. Zoroastrians held a very, very strong tradition of how knowledge is a virtue. Of course, then you have the Mamluks, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and how it developed the Sokoto Caliphate and several other sub-Saharan, transnational kingdoms and sultanates in South and East Asia, here in this territory, and so on. So all these political, entities over time, they managed to rival world empires, and they overtook them at some point. So tradition helped Muslims cope with social and political upheavals, from the sack of Baghdad, which was a major, major catastrophe, but Muslims survived that. Once Baghdad was devastated, the kind of center of gravity moved to Cairo. Then you had colonization and imperialism that had its own impact. and Muslims survived that, and modernity of the past 400 years. So let me rephrase this. Tradition has yet to find its role in Muslim context in the modern period. So this is all that I told you of what kind of work tradition did historically. But what kind of work must Islam as a tradition do in the modern period? That's where the greater challenge lies. You know, Alistair McIntyre wrote the big book, After Virtue, and resuscitates the discussion of tradition, the importance of tradition. He looks at the Western tradition, that the Western tradition had some elements that undermined Aristotle, and he felt that because of that, there were some deficits in the development of the Western tradition, and he wants to bring Aristotle back. And he wants to rebuild that Aristotelian tradition through Aquinas and others. In the context of modernity, the debates about tradition for Muslims are in many ways challenging and soul-searing. The modern entanglement of Muslim societies with others, people of other faiths, other communities, other cultures, meant that there was a significant transformation of Muslim life worlds, of multiple Muslim societies. As the Indonesian writer Pramudia Anantatur so effectively showed in some of his novels, he talks about the colonial period of what happened in this part of the world, that how the entanglement with the Dutch and the influence of the Dutch and certain kinds of industries that the Dutch were now controlling, building factories in Indonesia and so on, how the livelihood and the life worlds of colonial Java, for instance, change. He writes, for instance, that in colonial Java, the farmer could no longer farm his rice paddy. So he had to switch to sugarcane. And farmers who for centuries worked their own lands now became workers in the factories of the Dutch. And these factories were now staffed and managed by native Indonesian elites. In his novel, In a Child of All Nations, Pramudia makes us see the life of the once proud Javanese farmer through the eyes of a very strong and powerful journalist, Minke. The grinding poverty and the living conditions is such that even when these farmers own poultry, when they own chicken, they could no longer afford to consume such protein. Within a generation, they lost the culinary art of how to prepare chicken. Within a generation. Because they could no longer afford it. Or as Pramudia points out in another example, given the financial difficulties and straits that the rural families in colonial Indonesia suffered, patriarchal norms became more burdensome in getting their daughters and women married. And this significantly impacted the lives of women. Eventually, Dutch colonial managers sought out local Indonesian women, wives. And these women were surrendered by their families as concubines to the Dutch managers. And ironically, in every tragedy is also irony. As wretched as the system of concubinage was, it also gave rise to a whole class of women like in this novel, Nyai Ontisoro. Nyai Ontisoro is the concubine of the Dutchman, Mr. Malema. These women were now entangled with the colonial life world and became economically empowered because now they have money that they never had before. With their economic wealth, they earned a measure of autonomy, a certain amount of freedom from patriarchy. Not entirely, but a certain amount of freedom. Yet they also had to deal with the economic immorality of their wealth. And spiritually, they had to surrender part of their identity as having become different from the majority of Muslim Indonesians who did not enter into such levels of intimate entanglement with colonial life. So that's the interesting thing of what colonization does. It changes certain things, sometimes beyond people's control. This is the harvest of modernity at coloniality. Given the heritage of colonialism, these questions are not only about Islamic or Arab Islamic heritage in other parts of the world and tradition, it's also about the entanglement of cultures, symbol systems, forms of meanings and practices. People as far as Indonesia, Nigeria, Central Africa, Southern Africa, North America, in different Muslim contexts around the world, and Europe, all participate in these debates that I just talked about, tradition, actively or passively. Why? Because they are all a part of an ongoing Muslim identity debates. Namely, what is the good life for Muslims in terms of state formation, governance, citizenship, education, laws, and ethics? In the decades before independence, in the 20th century, many Muslim societies, you found kind of two narratives centered around tradition by two different constituencies. One group talked about the Turath tradition and Arab identity and varieties of Islamic. So they used the word Turath. Turath. At-Tajdeed wa Turath or Turath. Now, the people who use this term, Turath, were often folks who had a modern education. And they wanted to foster a kind of modern identity with something of Arab or Islamic components in it. They use modern moral and ethical languages of inquiry to find solutions. They took the entanglement of cultures and civilizations seriously and saw this as an opportunity to remake Islamic cultures and civilization. Their archive was a much more diverse account of multiple strands of Islam in the past. Yet to their critics, these folks tilted too far in the direction of the modern and abandoned essential elements of the past. Their flaw was that they viewed the authority of tradition to be directive and indicative. In other words, they saw the authority of tradition to be tawjihi, directive and indicative, as Yahya Muhammad put it, the Lebanese writer. A major drawback was that this group of modern educated people really never paid serious attention to the improvement of the political stakes in the light of tradition and its possibilities. And with the result that they left it to the secular norms and the modern nation state to drive their project. But another set of Muslim intelligentsia, mostly religious scholars, the ulama, for them also tradition was important. But tradition for them was constitutive. It was takwini. Tradition was constitutive. It organized and centered on a strong Muslim identity and morality, neither of which could be abandoned. But in this view, tradition was more, in my view, an exercise in power, especially moral power, instead of a complex discursivity. Exercising the power, the authority, more than discursivity. So the people who followed Turath, they were very complex in their discursivity. But for them, the Turath was tawjihi, it was directive, indicative. The other folks, the ulama, took the Turath as a strong weapon of identity or shield of identity, but also at the same time lacking in the complex discursivity, the complex argument. You can see that happening in the various institutions that I study very carefully, places like madrasas and hawzas in Southeast Asia, in South Africa, in the UK, even in the United States and other places where traditional education takes place. This is where you find a very strong attachment to tradition, but it's not a very complex tradition. It's rather simplex. So I think, in my view, the contestation over the meaning and content of Islamic tradition is the central challenge of modern Islam. And I think that the identity questions were always politicized to create, unnecessary conflicts. So one wishes that, for instance, the people that talked about Turath and the people who talked about Turath as Tawjihi and the people who talked about Turath as Takwini, as constitutive, it would have been great if there was a greater conversation between these two constituencies. Because if there was greater conversation, there would have been better outcomes. And unnecessarily from time to time, there were major court cases, people were accused of takfir. I'm thinking of the case of Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid and others, unnecessary, that just resulted in trauma. For tradition to play an important role in societies and to search for deep and strong meaning, tradition must be linked to lived experience. Cannot only be things in a library or things that academics talked about, but must be linked to lived experience, to what is happening in communities. Tradition cannot just merely be adherence to a past practice without searching for the intelligibility of that practice today. One of the major challenges to sustain tradition in Muslim societies is precisely how to cultivate the literacies of tradition. That's what I started off with. How to cultivate deep literacy of tradition. For the past 2 centuries, Muslims have grappled with the questions, say, education. Malaysia is famous for grappling with education, the International Islamic University, this institution, several other institutions about Muslim education and the formation of Muslim subjectivity. The key challenge is not whether higher education is failing or succeeding. The biggest challenge is the deficit of theological and ethical literacy in many Muslim seminaries, and I dare say even in the modern institutions that have Islamic. The Islamization of knowledge process created International Islamic University, Malaysia, Pakistan, there's one in Uganda and other places, if I remember correctly. I think the potential of that has not been fully achieved, or the goals or the objectives have not been fully achieved. A lot needs more to be done. Let me introduce an idea of, one of the things that we get from Abu Tayyib al-Mutanabbi, and this is what, I don't know what's wrong with this thing. It keeps on going on and off, but it's okay. Mutanabbi, this is a quote from Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali uses this towards this poem towards the end of his Mizan al-Amal. خذ ما تراه ودع شيئا سمعت به في طلعة الشمس ما يغنيك عن زحلي. So he says, forget all that you've heard, but take or hold on to what you see. This is very interesting that Ghazali uses this in the last 2.5 pages of Mizan al-Amal. Because he's saying that what you've heard, tradition is normally naql, what you've heard that is passed on. He uses Mutanabbi to do the work for him. Mutanabbi says, forget what you've heard. Follow what you are seeing in front of you. Mutanabbi is pushing us to become empirical. What you see, what you observe, that challenges sometimes what has already happened 300-400 years ago. Because in the ancient world, people used to look at the planet Saturn to find direction at night. Zuhal. But he says, when the sun rises, what use is Saturn to thee? What use is the planet? Once you can see something in front of you, once the reality is in front of you, Mutanabbi pushes this point hard that you must follow the empirical reality in front of you. Now, a couple of things we learn. That it is not unusual, it is not unusual for Muslim thinkers, past and present, I think, for instance, who use poetry for ihtijaj. Poetry is absolutely ihtijaj. I remember I was sitting once in a education meeting at the IIIT in what's the name? And a colleague gave a paper on education using Rumi and Rumi's insights. And one professor, I won't name him, Allah yarhamu, he said, but why are you using Rumi? Rumi is a poet. I said, as the senior professor, so it's tough to challenge him. I said, but Rumi has so much insight. Or maybe you didn't read Rumi in a long time. Because Rumi has a lot to teach you. A lot to teach us, insights. And we don't think that we can learn from Rumi insights about education and pedagogy. Or from Mutanabbi, we can't learn. These are the people in our tradition who've internalized a lot of things, and they are people of character, of insight, of ability, and so on. Ghazali, in Mizan al-Amal, in the last 3 pages, it's okay if this doesn't work. Ghazali, in the last 3 pages of Mizan al-Amal, he says something very interesting. Not too many people read those 3 pages or benefit from it in a way. He says that, thank you. He says that a madhab, there are 2 opinions on a madhab. First of all, he says the word madhab is mushtarak. Ghazali, I discover, a lot of things for him is mushtarak. If you read the Muqaddimah of Al-Mustasfa, that's the Muqaddimah, which is Mantiq. Ilm is mushtarak. Had, a definition is mushtarak. Everything is mushtarak. So mushtarak means it is polyvocal. It has one word can have multiple signifieds, multiple meanings. So one signifier can have multiple signifieds. And that gives Ghazali a lot of leeway to play with, because now he can do multiple moves. So he said the word madhab is mushtarak. Then he says there's 2 camps. Some who say that the word madhab means only one thing, so it's not mushtarak. But he says that the going opinion is that madhab can mean more than one thing. Then he says, first of all, let's call that the first camp who believes that madhab is more than one thing. The first camp believes that tradition is complex, it is layered, it is ambiguous, and it involves discursivity. It requires a critical predisposition, and you need to have informed practices. And the second camp, who says madhab is only one thing, they say that madhab is a simplistic, straightforward notion that claims tradition is just one thing, and Ghazali will be critical of this later position. And he says, if they tell you madhab is only one thing, only has one meaning, just agree with them, because you're just going to break your head trying to convince them otherwise. Then Ghazali, on the camp number 1, he said the word madhab means, it can mean on the one side that you can say a madhab is to express your solidarity and sociality. So he says, yata'assab. You can do ta'assub in favor of one party, especially in the displays of vainglory in mubahat, okay? In mubahat, and in choosing sides in the polemical debates and exchanges in munazarat. And in a longer paper that I've written on this section, I call madhab as a space for solidarity. Okay? So I'm elaborating that first meaning as madhab as a space for solidarity. I'm not going to spend too much time here today to talk more about that if you have questions. A second meaning of madhab, he says, relates to confidentiality and things that are secretly transmitted. Ma yusarru. Okay? So secretly transmitted content when a teacher or guide provides learned directives, ta'limat, and offers guidance, irshadat, to those who seek it. So when the teacher is giving guidance and also directives for those who seek it, this is what I call madhab as a space for the exercise of subjectivity. You're looking, so he says that he elaborates that in that instance, you must look at what is the level of the student. If you're going to tell the student that God is in this world and also not of this world, it's going to confuse that person. Might not get it. For such a person, you must just say, Allah sits on the throne. And that's His power and majesty. But to give him the philosophical, theological argument of, neither in the world, but also in the world, and how that works, could confuse such a person. So you have to make, or can the person really tolerate the information you're going to share? Because you can tolerate the different levels. A third meaning of madhab, he says, entails those discursive convictions a person holds firmly in one's soul, and those things that might be disclosed to one during a reflective process, or multiple reflective and discursive processes, when you're engaging in deep conversation. And this is what I frame as tradition as a space for discretion. It is the harvest of one's intellectual and spiritual investment. The amount he invested. In this third space, Ghazali wonders out loudly, how can a person with a corrupted temperament repel new and innovative ideas? He says, if you have a corrupted temperament, a person with that kind of temperament, how can such a person repel new and innovative ideas, which he or she can hardly comprehend? So he's arguing that sometimes our temperament is corrupted, that when new arguments are put in front of us, it's very difficult to absorb and to tolerate. But it's not the ideas, it's you. You're the problem. It's not the ideas. His judgment of such a closed-minded person who is unable to grasp ideas contrary to his formation and upbringing, he has a scorching answer. Quote, the answer to the likes of this person is to be silent and he be left to his devices. He will not be the first purblind person who perished because of him going astray. Because he says that person is like paper that has such bad ink stains that you either have to tear up the paper or you have to torch it. Ghazali can be quite tough at times. He's very strong in some of the things he says. Once he had laid out these positions of these two camps, the camps that believe that madhab has multiple registers and meanings and so on, and then he goes to the other one that madhab is only means one thing, he makes this very interesting quote. وَجَانِبِ الْإِلْتِفَاتِ إِلَى الْمَذَاهِبِ. Avoid relying on the authority of discursive traditions. Seek instead the truth by way of inquiry. I got the quote up there. So that you become a person who holds an authoritative viewpoint. You become a sahib madhab. And do not allow yourself to be in a position where you follow a guide like a blind person. You follow a guide like a blind person. The guide ostensibly directs you along a path, whereas you are actually surrounded by 1,000 guides like yours. Each warns that your guide will lead you to peril and mislead you. Only when you act on your decision to follow your guide, then you come to realize the tyranny of your guide. That your guide also has some flaws. Therefore, there is no salvation except in independent istiqlal, in thought. This is quite extraordinary. All those people that says Ghazali is the one who created the collapse of philosophy and the collapse of, I mean, it's now a small industry, right? Everybody's now saying that. Everybody who knows nothing about Islam wants to blame Ghazali for the collapse of Islam. They've never read this. And they might not be able to read it either. Maybe that's the reason they get it all wrong.
Is he targeting any group?
You see, the book begins with the question that in this you are sometimes taking from the Sufis, you are taking from some of the mutakallimun, you are sometimes taking from other theologians. Now you are taking from 3 madhabs. And normally one must only take from one. So the rest of the book is about this conversation. So he's targeting people who are saying that knowledge must only be in pure bundles, who can't handle interdisciplinarity, who can't handle knowledge coming from different frameworks. The Sufi framework is different. The Ash'ari theologians is another. The non-Ash'aris could be another. And he's saying all of these things can be resources for you to develop insights. You don't have to be locked into just one narrow confine. This is my reading of the book, and everywhere he goes, every chapter, he lays out arguments but this is the objective. So what he's targeting there are those people that say that knowledge is only one thing, the little bit that they know. The little bit that they know or the little bit that they have consecrated. Therefore, he's targeting also some of those teachers. And you must know that Ghazali is unusual amongst the fuqaha who believe that even a layperson must do some level of ijtihad. And what is the ijtihad of the layperson? The layperson, when you go to a town and you want to find a faqih, you must ask around at least, okay, how many faqihs are in this town? Like you look for a doctor, which doctor has good credentials. That little bit of work you do, that is your ijtihad for a layperson. He's a minority in that view. The majority says, that a layperson cannot do any ijtihad. But Ghazali believes that little bit of effort that you make, that's sufficient. If in writing these words, he says, then he quotes Mutanabbi's poem that I quoted earlier, if in writing these words yield no other outcome save to make you doubt your inherited beliefs, compelling you to inquire, then it was worth it. Doubt transports you to the truth. Who does not doubt fails to inquire, who does not inquire fails to gain insight. Without insight you remain blind and perplexed. We therefore seek God's protection from such a wretched result.
So doubt is good.
Doubt is a good thing. And Ghazali went through doubt himself. So Ghazali, very much, the reason we all should like Ghazali, because Ghazali goes through many, many phases in his life. He struggles. He has challenges. He has many, many challenges, intellectual, spiritual, other kind of challenges. And in many ways, his journey is the journey of many of us, in my view. The second point I want to talk about is about history. Modernity as a moment in a long historical process, as only a partially grasped event in human experience, and modernity is deeply embedded in the sensibility of history. So why is history so important in the modern world? Because in the modern world, history is all about breaking with tradition and creating a new tradition. So this is how I would, put the story. So we have two notions of time. we have calendrical time. Which year was the Prophet ﷺ born? When was this battle? What happened? When Al-Ghazali was born? And that is calendrical time. But there's another kind of time that is a kind of experiential time. Now that experiential time, when people used to write, so Ghazali writes an autobiography, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, right? Deliverance from error. He's talking about what happened in his soul, what happened to how he experienced the world. You know, I liked. He said I studied jurisprudence and law, and then I was good at it, but it didn't answer some questions. Just the 4 years he spends in Baghdad, the 2 years he's writing a great deal, and he's also writing political tracts, but he's also writing summaries of the philosophers and critique of the philosophers. But the next 2 years of those 4 years as a professor of Shafi law at the Nizami and Baghdad, the next 2 years is brutal. Brutal. He's in pain. He's now hating himself. And we don't exactly know why this is going through this, but having read Ghazali a lot and looking through lines and so on, I get a feeling that he felt that he was rather doing a disservice to his knowledge, because he now became an apologist for the Seljuks and writing books attacking their enemies and so on and so forth, and that he was in some ways not honest to the knowledge process himself. Even though, he's critical of the Ismailis. He writes Fadaihul Bataniya, the obscenities of the esoterists. It's a critique of the Ismailis and their political attacks on the Abbasid Empire and so on. He does all that, but he critiques the philosophers, but something just doesn't go right in him. And I think that Subki talks about it. Subki says that we don't find it anywhere in Ghazali's writing, but some of his biographers say that Ghazali felt that when he started his academic career, his scholarly career, that when his father died, they were so poor he had to go to a madrasa, where he got his boarding school, where he got his knowledge and food. He felt that when he was checking his intention, he thought he was not doing it for the right intention. It was in order to survive. And it was not in order for the dedication of God. And therefore, Ghazali, we don't get in any of Ghazali's writings, but some of the biographers say, طَلَبْنَا الْعِلْمِ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ فَأَبَى أَن يَكُونَ إِلَّا لِلَّهِ. That we searched for knowledge. We acquired knowledge, not truly for the sake of God, but knowledge refused to be but for God. So I think this idea of what purpose, the higher purpose, the noble purpose that knowledge must serve, he thought that his involvement in the politics of Baghdad was messing him up, and now he wanted to out. So my point about history. So this idea of history as history as an experience. See, one of the things that happens in a modern world, especially in Europe, Nietzsche announces the death of God. But the death of God for Nietzsche is not literally the death of God. What Nietzsche is concerned about is that the idea of God that people had of God is transcendent. Where Europe is going, where Europe is now developing, that God is no longer there. That is the God that was the horizon. What is the horizon? So Nietzsche saw that, and also Descartes. Descartes said that we need to have absolute certainty, this obsession of certainty. And Heidegger, reading both of them, especially Nietzsche in 4 volumes, Heidegger argues that what happens is that what we now see is only man. When you turn, you're only seeing human. You're not seeing anything else. Right? So this turn, when you're only seeing the human and you're not seeing the transcendent, that creates the inward looking, the locked in self. That is only about subjectivity. And now time is how I and you and everybody else experience it. So each one experiences time differently. So before, we lived in time. This is, Reinhard Koselleck saying. We used to live in time. Now we live through time. We live experientially through time. We believe that our bodies and our experiences, because there's so much emphasis on this, that this is now living through time. So time is no longer separate from us. Yes, of course time is separate. Today is Tuesday. So there's no Tuesday. There's the experience of Tuesday inside here, but there's no Tuesday written in here. So that is external. But this Tuesday for me could be very different from this Tuesday for you and for you and for you. This experiential. And we have valorized that greatly. And so that one of the challenges of modernity is precisely this question of time and the question of history. So now, so it's not only the history of individuals, but it's now the history of Malaysia, the history of Indonesia, the nation state, the history of the major powers, of Russia. So now every nation must have a unique history. So the battle today is about not where they're there, but whose history counts. So that's the product of modernity, whose history counts, and therefore history becomes very much that of a nation, of a part of the globe, the first world's history, the developing world's history, and so on and so forth. And you can also see how this plays out, for instance, in this conflict over Gaza. Whose history counts? Which people count, which people don't count. That is precisely the outcome of this. But it doesn't mean that we mustn't pay attention to history, because Ibn Khaldun says, the inner meaning of history involves speculation and verifying the truth, subtle causal analyses of the origins of things, and deep knowledge about the conditions under which events occurred and their reasons. For this reason, history is rooted in philosophy, and thus deserves to be counted among the disciplines of philosophy. History is a thinking discipline. It's not about counting and saying this happened and that happened and that happened. History is about thought. It's a thinking discipline. And I think that Ibn Khaldun is making a point there. And I connect Ibn Khaldun with Collingwood. Collingwood is a great historian who explains that, we tried, why do we study history? We study history so we can learn how to live. We learn how to live. And we get the self-knowledge for no other reason but the freer and more effectual self-revelation of that nature, of what is our nature, in a vigorous practical life. So I think Ibn Khaldun and Collingwood go well together. How are we doing for time, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, another 5 minutes.
Okay. So Ibn Khaldun is very big on the question of time and about understanding human affairs. I'm not going to labor that point. I just want to bring in Ibn Jinni. I want to give you an episode from Ibn Jinni. Ibn Jinni is the author of Al-Khasa'is, right? The great book in Arabic linguistics and grammar. It's very interesting that one should read these books. Let them not sit on your shelves only. It's impressive on the shelves. I'll be impressed if you have Ibn Jinni on your shelf. But if you read it, and I was chasing up one source, and then I came across the story. And that was that. So Ibn Jinni, as you know, is a Mu'tazili. Other interesting issue is that a generation before, his father is of Greek slave. His father was a Greek slave. The son becomes an extraordinary scholar of Arabic. In one generation, he's moving around in the courts of Aleppo and Fars. And that's something for upward mobility. So Ibn Jinni is trying to understand, does the ilal, the ratio ligis, right? The ilal, the illah. Everybody understand the illah? The ilal is the ilal of grammar, of nahu. Is the ilal of nahu similar to the ilal in kalam, or is it more similar to the ilal in fiqh? So he says, now he goes through a whole set of arguments and so on, and he concludes that no, that the ilal in grammar are similar to the ilal in ilmul kalam. Why? Because they are both are based on sensory perception, on his. His view, they are based on his, on sensory perception. Then he forgets about whatever he wants to say about the ilal of fiqh. He doesn't pursue that debate. But he then goes on to say and give several stories about Islamic law. And he says of Islamic law that, he said the diya and qisas, for instance, he says, the diya and qisas in Islamic law, he says, was devised in order to lower bloodshed in Arab society. To lower bloodshed, so you don't have continuous feuds. So you killed somebody by accident or intentionally or whatever the case may be, you murdered somebody, you're injured, so now you have to do compensation, right? There are the three options. Either the party that is been injured can ask for the life of the other person, the other family, the other tribe rather, the person, the killer, or you can give compensation, or you can pardon. The three options. But he then says, gives another example. He says, for instance, even in the Jahiliyyah, these are Jahili practices. He says also in the Jahiliyyah, it was that people were insistent on nasab, on paternity, because people want to be sure who is the father, and therefore they had also penalties for when you violate those rules. Then he provides a very interesting quote, very interesting conclusion. And that for me was very important. The whole long quote, you don't have to spend too much time. But what he says that, okay, so we can go through, he said, you can now concede that the understanding of the reason, the asbab for the fiqh rules are similar to grasping the ilal at work in grammatical inflections. He said, you might concede, but he said there could be an objection. Why did you rank the rationis, the ilal of fiqh, to be lesser in status compared to the rationis of grammar? The reply would be, what was described above as the rationis of fiqh amount to a conclusion that is not derived from the discursive tradition of fiqh, not from the madhab and the discussions of fiqh. Nor is it related to the topic of obligation fard and the command of revelation of the shara. Rather, compliance to the norms of fiqh is a matter lodged in the souls long before the revelation transmitted. بل هو قائم في النفوس قبل ورود الشريعة به. This is very interesting. That he said that very of these practices are the habits of the heart. These are habits that pre-existed. And the very key issue is that laws are developed the way people, we think laws are devised in order to create order, but We also think about law that, oh, if I don't follow this law, I'm going to be. Sometimes the law doesn't work. The law doesn't work on your heart. It's no longer part of your heart. It's no longer part of your custom and your urf. In fact, Shah Waliullah himself grapples with this. He says that he has a chapter in Hujjatullah al-Baligha where he talks about, in the section called Dinun Yansahul Adyan. Dinun Yansahul Adyan, a section there. And then he talks about this prophet ruler who comes into the world. And he says this prophet ruler, ideally, when he creates a law, he should ideally make the law that is common among all the tribes that he is ruling over. That's what you should be. All the tribes. But he says, all the tribes don't convert and work with the Prophet from day one. It takes a long time. So what the Prophet then does, he starts with the rules of his own tribe who converted. Now he says there's a problem, Shah Waliullah says. So he says in the sha'air and hudud, he says, وَلَا يُضَيِّقُ كُلَّ التَّضْيِيقِ فِي الشَّعَائِرِ وَالْحُدُودِ وَال something else. I'm blanking on the last word. But then he says, بَل يُشْفِقْ عَلَيْهِمْ بل يشفق عليهم بالجملة. No, he doesn't use the word يشفق. بل يبقي عليهم في الجملة. بل يبقي عليهم في الجملة. أبقى يبقي means, it's not بقى يبقي as many people misread it. بل يبقي عليهم في الجملة يعني بل يشفق عليهم في الجملة. That you must be compassionate to them. So in the matters of sha'air and in the matters of hudud, and the third thing that I'm blanking on, he says what you need to do, that you must be compassionate in those matters. And you must not make people, وَلَا يُضَيِّقُ كُلَّ التَّضْيِيقِ. Don't put people into a bind on those issues. What Ibn Jinni is saying, what Shah Waliullah is saying in 1762, 760 years apart, in their death, is similar. In other words, laws and norms are things that works with your subjectivity, what works for you. Not necessarily something that comes from Mars, from a different space. To conclude, what I'm trying to say in this question of tradition and the examples I gave you is that we need to begin thinking about tradition in a critical fashion. And we need to study tradition through the lens of norms, but also the conditions under which we are living. There's no way that you can turn the clock back under the conditions what you're living. We are now moving into a information society, point 2 and 3, and in 50 and 20 years or 5 years, you're all going to be beneficiaries of ChatGPT and quantum computers and all the kind of new things. We're already doing all the stuff. I mean, you said 20 years, 30 years ago that you're not going to use the World Wide Web. We're all using the World Wide Web. And we're getting great benefit out of the World Wide Web. And the World Wide Web is also problematic because it creates isolated individuals. We don't have skills to communicate, but still there are benefits and harms. But coming back to my big question is critical traditionalism. Everything in tradition, so one of the things I said in the beginning of my talk that I didn't show you is someone said, can you give the bumper sticker version of your talk, right? And so I said, tradition has a vote in the making of norms and values. It has a vote, not a veto. But history has a veto. History vetoes certain things. Time, that's my taking. So tradition has a vote in the making of norms and values, but history has a veto. We are not going to go back to slavery. We are not going to go back to patriarchy. We are not going back to many other things. History rules certain things out over time. And we need to study our tradition critically and develop the literacy and the complexity of the tradition. And many And this complexity, I just gave you a snapshot of how Ghazali thinks about these issues, how Ibn Jinni thinks about these issues. If you all dedicate yourself to the study of tradition critically, not if you discover it now you're going to say, I'm only going to follow this. No, you need to figure out what of this is going to work for you. But then you'll see the beauty, and you'll see the great power of thinking that the tradition allowed you to think with. Because once you study tradition, tradition shows you how to think. And then you can build the tradition going forward. I thank you for your time. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ebrahim, for such an insightful lecture. I'm pretty sure a lot of questions lingering in your minds right now, so feel free to switch on the mic, introduce yourself, and direct to the question. Probably we start with Prof. Osman. Okay. Yeah, okay.
Isham, talk is fascinating. It's a little bit over my head somewhat. This idea that because of the tradition that you have, you will see things differently. I assume that's the how different would it be? First,
How different will?
give me a concrete example of how other people would see it differently, and now we would see it differently in the Muslim tradition, especially.
You know, 500 years ago, or maybe not so long ago, people thought slavery was perfectly okay. Okay? Now,
But then you have the problem of the legal support. So if you wanted to change that, you would have to change the legal structure also. So are we also talking about changes in the legal structure?
So, the legal structure, a tradition, a living tradition, can't have a dead law. A living tradition. Now you can have a dead tradition with dead law. That's also your choice. An American theologian at Yale, why I forget his name now, he says something to the effect that tradition is the living faith. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. So there's
concrete examples. The slavery one, yeah, relatively easy. Give me a more subtle changes that you expect. The patriarchal one also is a little bit more subtle, but something more subtle that predominates the changes that you want people to change. So we have people who keep looking at the past and seeing it as the ideal,
right,
and trying to almost implement the whole thing today.
Yeah.
But you're arguing that actually there are lots of changes. I'm unique. You started off saying that the Umayyad were actually translating text. In other words, the old saying, neither east nor west, Islam is the best. In other words, we don't need anyone else. We just need ourselves.
Yeah.
And of course, the Umayyad never agreed with that. And the rest also never agreed. The whole project of translation was learning from anywhere you can get. So how would you, I said, we have an inferiority complex today. And so going back to the past, an idealistic past is somewhat of our inferiority complex. We are unable to move forward. You're suggesting that we do need to move forward. So if you give concrete, but examples that subtle things that we should be changing.
Yeah. So thank you. So the first thing, if you want to make change to any tradition, is that you need to have confidence. And the confidence is both psychological and historical. So if you can show, and you can demonstrate that how people in the past made changes, you gain confidence that you can make changes in your present. So it requires two things. we need to study the past very carefully, and not in a kind of a simplistic way, but in a complex way. And 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 so therefore I gave the examples of Ghazali, who says the madhab is a much more complex thing. It can mean, he says, if you grew up in a Hanafi area, you will have predisposition toward Hanafis. If you grew up in a Mu'tazili area, you're going to be there. If you grew up in Imami area, so that already. So what he's saying, anthropology shapes your madhab, sociology shapes your madhab. Second, he says your profession and your work shapes your madhab. Thirdly, he says that your intellectual endeavors and investments, that also shapes your madhab, right? So that's what I'm saying. That's what my invitation is, not to tell people what to change, but to show what is the algorithm for change. In other words, what is the hard work that needs to be done in order to make change meaningful, viable, and possible in Islamic thought. So that's the first part. The second point I want to say is that Ghazali's big story was that different streams of knowledge can work together. Different streams of knowledge. And that is the core challenge for Islamic thought today. Islamic thought is only thinking that only something that is written in Arabic, maybe sometimes in Persian, maybe sometimes in Turkic, could be, is worth investment. We are saying to ourselves, knowledge produced in the past 400 years is tainted by the different culture and civilization, and it is not usable. Meanwhile, we're living in that same civilization. We are now working in that civilization. We have adopted that civilization in varieties of ways. And we are still not bringing, so there's lots of, for instance, work being done on hermeneutics and interpretation by major writers, people who did work on biblical studies, in Jewish studies, in other studies, hermeneutics as a form of interpretation, in literature, insights of how do you read a text, kinds of things that will make, I mean, if Ibn Arabi makes you dizzy the way he reads a text, then this will make you even more dizzy, right? And you can see the layers of meaning and so on. So what I'm saying is that that's the second concrete example that I'm trying to point out with this lecture is that we need to begin taking knowledge per se as seriously. When I gave this talk somewhere else, someone asked, are you talking about Islamic law or theology, and that those two areas require change? I said, no, we require a whole epistemological revolution. In other words, the knowledge of the past must intermingle with the knowledge of the present. And I think Muslims are sharp enough and intelligent enough that what doesn't work for them, they will leave aside. And that what works for them, they'll pick up. But this thing that he says, danger, don't touch. This is is infantilizing the Muslim mind. That is infantilizing the Muslim mind. And I think that's the concern that I am. That's my point. And so tradition is necessary, but we have an infantile version of tradition that is circulating in our institutions, kind of very, 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 very brittle, very, very fragile version of tradition. And what we need to look is find the adult version of tradition, the grown-up version of tradition.
Do you have any priority areas that we should be starting taking baby steps in?
I think the first thing is we have to, our curricula in our institutions must become inclusive. You can't be a faqih and not study sociology. You can't be a faqih and not study anthropology and philosophy. What's his name? Abdul Shakur al-Bihari, for instance, in his book Musallam al-Thubut says, fiqh is al-fiqhu hikmatun far'iyyatun shar'iyyah. It's a certain kind of philosophical endeavor. We have just made fiqh to be analogy. So we just use qiyas and so on, just analogical. So there's the baby steps. The baby steps is first read our tradition. This is the baby step. Read our tradition. Read our tradition with complexity. I can tell you something. There are a lot of things that I read without knowledge traditions from what we would call outside Islam. I just glanced over it. But once you begin thinking and you study anthropology, you study sociology, you say, wait a minute. This person is saying something else here. Now you're thinking what this person is writing in a different way. But if you did not have that larger framework of reference, you would overlook that. So for instance, what's her name is here, one of the participants in our madrasa this courses, Zulqarnain, and I trained about 120, 30 participants from India, Pakistan over 5 years in developing scientific and theological literacy, sponsored by the Templeton Foundation that gave the grant and so on. All of those people, once we equip them with some tools of thinking that they've never been exposed to, they suddenly say, but this looks interesting. So they heard of Ghazali but never read a page of Ghazali. They heard of Taftazani but only read 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 pages of Taftazani when they're in the madrasa because they never complete the book. Now we expose them to Ash'ari, Maturidi, reading it firsthand, and we give them Collingwood and Koselleck to think about history and stuff. They go on autopilot. They start running. And then they say, because some of them say for instance, one of my students, Sher Ali, he looks at the story that everybody knows in South Asia, the debate that happened between Shah Ismail, and he writes this book. Shah Ismail is the grandson of Shah Waliullah. And, okay, forget about that story, but Qasim Nanotwi, the founder of Deoband, has debates with Christians and Hindus. And it's called, Munazara Shahjahanpur, okay? The debate at Shahjahanpur. Now, Sher Ali is equipped with a variety of technologies, my student at Duke, and he reads this debate and he finds so many things. And my madrasa students are saying, but now, how do you see so many things? How did he see so many things? If you have more lenses, you can see more. If you just have one lens, you can only see one thing. So we need to put on lenses. And lenses means different knowledge disciplines, ways of understanding and so on, that we equip ourselves with that, we begin to see more in these materials. Thank you. Yes, sir. Zulqarnain. Alaikum salam.
Thank you so much for this wonderful, remarkable presentation, Prof. I was thinking that's very important to look at even fiqh madhaib or the Islamic tradition as a whole in terms of complexities and intricacies and multi-layered and all. But the fact that some of the opinions or the others became dominant and hegemonic in our tradition, in fiqh tradition and Kalami tradition and all, even though there are a lot of diversity when we dig up and we go inside there. So how do you explain this thing? Is it something that Foucault, for example, has talked about the hegemony, power and knowledge, those kind of dynamics? So were those dynamics were also active in our tradition? This is the first question. Second question, how do you look at the relationship between different traditions in today's world, for example? Because when those traditions that we go back in Islamic tradition, fiqh and all, that time I feel that there was no question of relationship with the other traditions. Those were active, living, engaging with their time, in their time with all the knowledge existing that time, for example. So Farabi, for example, or Ghazali or those people, they were not having their own alienated different Islamic knowledge system or Islamic world. They were the dominant knowledge system at that time. But now we are alienated or we are isolated, we are undermined, marginalized, everything. And now we want to go back to our tradition. From the very beginning, it seemed that we have to start and end in our own world, in our own island. So how do you look when we go back our tradition and come back with new things which are more relevant and more congruent to the time? So to what extent and how can we become more sharing and common with the existing conventional modern knowledge system? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Should I take one question at a time?
Yeah.
Or
Probably
take two.
two, three? Two. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Next, please.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Iftikhar Jamil. I joined Madrasa
Can we
Islam.
give lady a chance, and I come back to you, okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor. My question is, postmodernist philosophy seems to have reached its end because it cannot accurately capture the dynamics of social media-driven world with a
Cannot capture what?
social media-driven world with post-COVID experiencing life. In your opinion, what will be the next paradigm shift in philosophy? Do you think it can break free from the old stereotypes of Islam and Muslims that have unfortunately continued to this day? That's it.
Can you? I'm to do justice to your question. So, something about postmodern philosophy as a problem. Yeah. And the other thing was that what is the next shift in philosophy in terms of Islam, and what was that?
Postmodernism has started and even is going to end.
Okay.
Or some philosophers say that has ended already.
Okay.
But you have talked about modernity. So I would like you to line the draw where is it really modernity you were talking about, or you were talking also about postmodern area? So my question is, what will be the thing that will shift in Muslim societies, and what will break free from the old stereotypes about Islam and Muslims?
Who's holding those stereotypes? Muslims themselves or outsiders?
Outsiders and also Muslims.
Oh, okay. Okay, gotcha. Okay. Let's take the third question.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Iftikhar Jamil. I joined Madrasa Discourse program in Bangladesh. So can you explain more about Ilalun Nahu? I mean, can you compare, in our context, can you compare Sharh Jami to Khasais? I mean, their differences and their perspectives? Thank you.
Okay.
We just take three questions first, and then I'll come back to you.
We'll come back. Yeah. So, Zulkarnain's question. Maybe start from your question. You know, this question of modern, postmodern, postmodern. These are various ways that people are trying to identify a particular modality of thinking, a particular way of living, and so on, right? Now, in every modern, there's also tradition. So, alongside modernity, and so what is modernity in many ways? Modernity, in one way, is in the political level, is the end of rulers of kings and feudal lords, in politically, and the development of the high point is nation states and democracy in political modernity. In terms of, for instance, religion, it's the big battle that Europe had between papal authority and Lutheranism that says no, individuals can also understand God without the institution of the papal authority, right? So the breakdown of centralized. And after Luther, the Catholic Church changed too. The Catholic Church gave up having dominions and lands and having armies and so on, right? So that in the religion, so religion becomes a private thing. That was part of modernity. In science, And technology, the modernity was the discovery of steam engine, a new form of engine, a new form of power, material power, to move ships, to create engines, and to create different phases of industrial economies and industrialization, and be able to utilize materials and make things and move things around the world, right? Happened during colonialism and so on and so forth. So each one of those examples I gave you are not pure. So if you have privatization of religion in Lutheranism, Catholics still one community, right? If you're talking about democratic formations and politics and individuals have the power to elect their rulers, you have democratic societies with kings on the top as titular rulers. The King of England now, right? There's monarchies, but so all of these things are also mixes. So sometimes we misunderstand some of these things, but say it's just one thing. So when we think about ideas, when you think about in their complexity, nothing is entirely modern. There's always tradition side by side. So the Lutherans are still praying with the prayer book that they had, the prayers that they had before the Reformation set in. You see what I'm saying? So the first thing that I would say is nothing is just modern. It's very messy. There's also tradition and stuff in it. So people talk about modernity, and modernity was seen as very, it made certain universal claims, and these universal claims were false, because everybody did not buy into it. So people then said, we have to think about different kinds of modernities. There's not only one modernity, there are alternative modernities. The Chinese have their modernity, the Japanese have their modernity, the Indians have their modernity. Okay? I mean, there are philosophers who talked about that there was already a modernity, the kind of modern work being done in the Sanskrit, in some part of Indian history, where there was a new ways of interpreting the text in Sanskrit. That was the modernity in Sanskrit in Indian history. You see what I'm saying? So sometimes we get carried away and we use modernity either as a swear word in order to fulfill certain objective, but we really didn't understand. And so the postmodern era was to challenge modernity in all its objective claims. So the postmodern went to Nietzsche and Heidegger. And the postmodern said that, well, what about the self? The modern said the self is universal, and the self is like this. And I said, no, but this is a European self you're talking about. You're not talking about a Muslim self, a Hindu self, a Buddhist self. It's the self that came out of one experience. So you can't talk about the self out of one experience and make that universal. So the postmodern picks up on the Nietzschean line where they explained about, how the enclosure of the self. Now the critique of the postmodern is, where's the objectivity? Are there objective truths? Right? That's one of the big challenges. Are there objective truths? In some ways, a postmodern has to accept there is gravity. Otherwise, he or she is going to fall on their backs, or worse. You have to accept gravity. You have to accept sodium chloride is one element is sodium, and two components of chloride gives you salt, right? These are all objective things. So it's the big challenge is in the meaning-making areas where modernity, postmodernity, how do you make meaning out of that? And what are your building blocks for making meaning? Are you with me? So your question is, what is the next shift in philosophy going to be? I don't know. But I think that there's a pushback against some elements of the postmodern, and there's return to tradition. So it's becoming a little bit a little bit more messy. So what you will see is what Ghazali did. He mixed it all up. So interdisciplinarity, no one is purely modern and purely anti-modern and purely traditional. It's the messiness. If we don't see the messiness of our reality, we're going to miss it. And what the thing about the shift in how other people, how other people see Muslims and Islam, that's their deficits. If they don't understand the world, but Muslims must make the world that they want to live in, and they must make it good and make it attractive that others want to come to it. To the question of Zulqarnain about that some forms of fiqh are dominant and others are not. So it is the question of power. And I did, in my opening remarks, I said, those who believe that tradition is tawjihi, that is directive and indicative, they have a bigger apparatus of knowledge systems to work with. Because there are also, many of them are people, they want to use the tradition, but they're also understanding the world in which they are living in. And the others, the ulama, think that the tradition is takwini, it is constitutive. But they're not using it, the constitutive plays the role only for authority and power. So that's what you are pointing at, that it is dominant one that is playing out. Now, that the power can only be challenged if there is diversity. So the reason why there is a singular understanding of fiqh in some places, because people believe that madhab means only one thing. But if you go with the Ghazalian line, that there's multiplicity, it is mushtarak, there are different kinds of background, you can then possibly find that madhab means many more other things. And it's very interesting, but Ibn Khaldun says later on that solidarity, ta'assub, and asabiyya is the thing that makes people come together. Ghazali also talked about that. At one understanding of madhab is how people have solidarity. Very interesting thing that he says, now that you give me the opportunity to think about it, is that one of the examples he gives, he says, that when the asabiyya is strong and the tullabur riyasa, those people who are desiring to have power, can't get their way. So solidarity is strong, because if solidarity is weak, you can go to the one group and say, hey, let's do this, and go to the other group, and you can manipulate the situation. But when the solidarity is strong, and the people who have political objectives, they can't break through, what they do is that they make the people fight over very, very trifling things. He says he makes them fight over what is the real right flag, the white flag or the black flag. He gives the example. And then these people fight over the black flag is the right one, and another says the right flag is the right one, and with the result, there's division, and the politicos move in, and they can dominate. I thought that is exactly how politics happen today. I mean, what is contemporary politics? You find something about your opposition, and you make a claim, and you brand them with that. Oh, yeah, you use that kind of soap, and that's not a good soap, and so on. So you're supporting, imperialists, and then the next thing is that the followers is now going to fight amongst each other. So that's how opposition breaks through. Ghazali gives very interesting examples. So, but if you think about, it is about power and authority at one level. But if you begin to want to break that solidarity, you want to break that uniformity that some people are advocating, then you must show that there are alternatives. I mean, I was saying the other day that the one great gift of Ibn Hazm and the Zahiris were, the Zahiris said, what gives you as a faqih the license? When God had made certain things halal and haram, what gives you the license as the faqih that you use analogy now to extend that haram in all other things that look similar to it? And the halal to all. I mean, the mubah is mubah, right? So, but the haram now, you do things by extension haram. The critique is right. You are not authorized to do it. If the hukam is clear, that's it. Don't do it by extension now, other things. So if the Quran says that khamr is prohibited, then khamr is prohibited. And it is grape wine and date wine. Done. If there are other kinds of things that you don't think is good, you must use siyasa. You must use governance. And good governance to tell people, don't smoke pot, don't use other kinds of beverages that can also be intoxicating. You must use good governance. You must inculcate good values. But you can't threaten people with God every time. So, but this threatening people with God has in some ways created a certain kind of mentality that's very harmful. So God becomes like a policeman that's beating you all the time, which was not the purpose. All these ahkam, the 400 ahkam verses of the Quran, most of that, as Ibn Jinni says, بل هو قائم في النفوس قبل ورود الشريعة به. It was already part of people's practices. What the Quran just did, that said to the Arabs and to the Muslims, well, this is how you organize yourself, and so on. Now, the good thing that Islamic jurisprudence did do is that it did a lot of extensions and created order, and through law, it's a very sophisticated development, so law is there. But most of these is not ahkam taklifiyya, it's ahkam wad'iyya. It's not ahkam taklifiyya, it's ahkam wad'iyya. These are things that human beings devise. So that's the one. Second thing is that you took something about the dominant knowledge system, right? Yeah. So I think the early Muslims, therefore I'm saying read the tradition, I think the early Muslims were very clear that all knowledge was there. Everything was for them. It belonged to them. This powerlessness that Muslims experience through colonization has in some ways injured us psychologically. I remember in 1994, South Africa had its first elections, first democratic elections. As most of you know, I'm from South Africa. And Sheikh Rashid Ghanouchi, who's unfortunately in jail again, came to visit. He spent a month, and I spent a lot of time with him. So we were having a lot of debates and conversations and so on. And I said to him, we have to do ijtihad. He said, no, but if you do ijtihad in a time where other culture is dominant, you're going to incorporate some of those elements. So I said, then we've already, our tradition has already shown it, we swallowed a lot of Greek in our jurisprudence and in our kalam. So it is a done thing. We are used to that. We take other things that came from other way. I mean, this is the beauty of the Islamic tradition. It takes from everywhere and turns a thing into something unique. So I think that, he has many challenges in Tunisia. He gave up government. He only controlled what's the name. But if Muslims were thinking, they could find creativity. And ijtihad is creativity, the power of creativity to have solutions. Their biggest problems, as he told me later on when I met him again, our biggest problem is corruption. How do you solve corruption? You have to have innovative. I mean, it's not the first society that is corrupt, but there are societies that were corrupt that became less corrupt. It is done in human history. But there are ways in which you do that, and so on. So anyway, so I think the dominant knowledge system, and I don't think we should be afraid, but I think there are people that are scaring Muslim scholars all the time. There are people going on and using scare tactics to intimidate Muslims. And I'm telling you, don't be afraid. God is not going to punish you if you took utlubul ilmi min al-mahdi ila al-lahad seriously. Seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave. Knowledge is al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min. This is the crisis. This is the Islamic thought's crisis. This Islamization stuff really didn't help. I know there are a lot of people here might be loving Islamization. I'm happy to respectfully disagree. It didn't help. It created psychological crutches. And now that so you get my point. The question of Ilalun Nahu and Sharajami and so on. Your question there. Look, Khasa'is is a different kind of book. Mullah Jami that writes, the book's name is we call it Sharajami in South Asia, but it is called Al-Diya'iyya, something Al-Diya'iyya. Mullah Jami is using a different way. I'm trying to find the kind of philosophical. Mullah Jami is also very, very mystical. So he's trying to find certain kind of mystical elements in Arabic grammar and so on. So I was not entirely sure what your question was in that issue about the difference between Sharajami and Khasa'is. It's a comparison. Yeah. I mean, I think it's two different kinds of books. Yeah, Mullah Jami is more into the grammar and the philosophy of grammar, and the Khasa'is is more historical and philosophical. If I understood both books correctly. Yeah. There's some questions up there. Helman.
Yeah, probably we take last two questions.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, gentlemen.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. I am Abdul Basit from Pakistan.
Yes.
Sir, you talk very nicely about the civilization and the tradition of Islam. But sir, my opinion is when we talk about the system and the civilization and the tradition of Islam, we associate a basic human and basic need with religion, where Islam emphasizes on the training of the individuals, not discuss the lifestyle, their living style, their eating style, their dresses. Although it is all these things are the very major part of Islamic history, but it is my opinion that it is not the part of Islamic teaching. What do you say about this?
Let me see if I understand your question first. So help me understand your question. So you're saying that the dress, the civilization, and
the political system, our different needs of society, it is not the major part of Islamic teaching. It is the part of Islamic history as well. I know in the period of Khulafa Rashidin and Banu Umayyah and Banu Baz, but it is not the focused and not the, I think it is not the basic part of Islamic teaching. What you say about?
So what is the, then, and then I need to know that you have a answer that I need to know first. So what is the core part of Islamic teaching?
Sir, Islam wants to teach the individual.
Teach the individual.
Individual.
And
Address the
what
individual.
does it want to teach the individual?
About when he speaks truth and about the ibadat and about their behavior between each other. But he's address every time, it is my opinion, many times, not every time, address the individual, not as a society.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's an interesting opinion. Man does not live, or woman does not live by ibadat alone. Man or woman does not live by ibadat alone. You need to eat. You need to drink. You need to be sheltered. You need to have a community to defend you when you are threatened from outside. You need to have an army. You need to have governance. So Islam makes certain things required for salvation. So the story of salvation in Islam is the ibadat, right? But these ibadat can't go on their own. They require what Shah Waliullah says, irtifaqat. They require these support of civilization that does that helps us in making society. So, ما لا يتم الواجب إلا به فهو واجب. That if the ibadat is wajib, if that is the core, believing God, accepting the teachings of the messenger, which is the core thing, but if you cannot complete that, except by that you need to have other things, then that other things become obligatory too. Therefore, human civilization is important. Ibn Khaldun and other scholars talk about Umran, the whole idea. How does Umran, how does lived habitation work? How do people live together? How do they disagree? How does dynasties function? So that would be my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Another question from the ladies?
Yeah.
Anybody?
Do we have
Okay.
final question from the ladies? That's a
Yes.
specific requirement.
Any objections? That's also fine.
Yeah.
Any disagreements? Yes. There's someone already there, I think.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. I think someone on that side. No? You want to say something, ma'am? No. I'm inviting the sisters first. Anybody? Yes. Okay. All right. You can have the last
Okay.
question.
Yeah, as you spoke about Islamization of knowledge, that there are some issues. Even from past, I have some questions on this. Why they are trying to Islamize everything, like Islamization of knowledge or Islamization of psychology? My question is why we, or maybe not you, some scholars, they are trying to Islamize everything.
Yeah, I think that one of the issues there's good reason. You know, in the 1970s, 80s, there was a big surge in all over in the United States in particular of identity politics. So, for instance, black studies, women's studies, right? That people want to show that knowledge says something about women, about black people. Black people get left out. You only have the history of white people, right? So black studies, African American studies, and so on. And I think there was Ismail Farouqi, Allah yarhamu, also possibly felt the need that, you know, Muslims and Muslim contribution to culture and civilization is left out from the knowledge conversation. I think that Muslims' experiences are left out. See what I'm saying? So that means we have to study more Islamic history. We have to study the tradition, how Muslims lived and how they thought. So he had two parts of the project. One part of the project was to teach modern educated people his famous small book that is about the lecture he gave in Makkah at the educational conference, which he said that he wants to teach modern educated people what Islam is. And he wants to teach the theologians and the scholars, the religious scholars, what the modern world is. And therefore, so then they talked about, you know, Aslamatul Ma'rifah. So, yeah. Look, I was also taken by that at the time. We were all taken by that. It was very powerful. And we were all on that bandwagon. But I at least, and several others, quickly realized the limitations of that. And then we realized, no, you need to take a deep dive into all kinds of knowledge. That is the Islamic obligation towards knowledge. Not the Islamization of knowledge, but the Muslim carries the obligation towards knowledge to learn knowledge from whatever source. Al-ilmu la madhhaba lahu. Ilm doesn't have a religion. And this is very important. I think somehow we give ilm a religion. I can benefit from a Muslim can benefit from Augustine or from Aquinas, as Catholics benefit from Ibn Rushd. I mean, everybody, knowledge is the common heritage of all. And people used a great deal of Muslim insights at various stages of European culture and civilization. So they became beneficiaries of that. Why can't we become beneficiaries of what other people are thinking? We have to look at, for instance, what China is doing. China is a major civilization that we're ignoring. We're only looking west. So I think we need to, so I think the Islamization of knowledge was a thing, but I think we lost our way in forgetting about knowledge. And we got stuck on the Islamization part. But it's a knowledge project. It just takes knowledge very seriously.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Ebrahim Moosa. I think we benefited a lot from this 2-hour lecture. And those who would like to re-listen to this lecture can go to the YouTube channel of ISTAC, and they can listen back in case you miss any points. Before we end, I would like to invite Professor Emeritus Dato' Dr. Osman Bakar to deliver a token of appreciation to our guest speaker. So please, welcome.
On behalf of the Dean, he has left because he has to attend some other function. So in this matter, I don't know whether you have seen this one.
No? Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Can we take the photo here?
Yeah.
Wait, bro.
You come there.